And during this stage of easing restriction, perhaps we can learn from Australia and New Zealand as well how they plan to be working together at this very juncture. And Kun Nat, you have this story for us, especially travel bubble between Australia and New Zealand. What is it like?
Okay, the travel bubble refers to both countries trying to open the borders to each other. So that's just only a possibility at the moment. So tomorrow, both New Zealand and Australia will be discussing with each other in terms of how they're going to ease the borders so that Australians and New Zealanders can travel to respective countries. This is actually only an idea, and it will be discussed in the cabinet tomorrow. So both countries have closed their borders since March due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has highly affected their tourism industry. So right now, both countries are considering at opening the borders to each other. So hopefully Australians and New Zealanders can travel between each other without the need to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. So that's in the consideration at the moment.
That's very interesting. But why Australia consider New Zealand, and why does New Zealand consider Australia to have travel bubble? So obviously they are each other's first choice. Why is that?
Because Australia and New Zealand have very strong bilateral relations for so many years, and their relationship is pretty much the closest relationships compared to other countries around the world. So Australians can work and travel in New Zealand without a visa, and that applies the same thing for New Zealanders that can travel and work in Australia without a visa. More than that, both countries also contribute to each other's tourism industry. There's one information that's very interesting. 39.5% of overseas arrivals in New Zealand are Australians. On the other hand, 15.1% of overseas arrivals in Australia are New Zealanders. So we can see that there is an exchange between two countries in terms of tourism. So we can see that they have a very strong relationship, and they actually contributed to each other's tourism industry.
Very interesting the way they are trying to help each other, Kun Thepchai, because right now we cannot refuse that each country are facing with COVID-19, but this is perhaps the first kind of cooperation between neighboring countries.
It's quite obvious that New Zealand and Australia have a very unique relationship. And to demonstrate that, in the meeting of the cabinet in Australia tomorrow, as Kun Nat just mentioned, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand will be joining the cabinet meeting of Australia, of course by video conference, to discuss the proposal. So this is something unprecedented that according to the media report, that the leader of one country joining a cabinet meeting of another. But this is how things work between these two countries. We have been having very close and unique relationship. So this is quite interesting to find out what will transpire after the cabinet meeting tomorrow. But of course, the decision, if it's ever made in that direction, will come as a big boon for the airline industry for the two countries. As we all know, both Air New Zealand of New Zealand and the Qantas airline of Australia have been suffering quite heavily, and New Zealand has reduced its workforce by as much as 95% since the border closure, and the airline has said that as many as 1/3 of its employees could lose their jobs. And equally bad is also is for Qantas Airways, which has put 20,000 workers on leave until the end of May at least. So as the sooner the resumption of the travel between two countries, the better for the two airlines.
That's right. And with the COVID-19 situation, what's happening in both Australia and New Zealand, especially in New Zealand in particular, Kun Nat?
So for New Zealand, as of today, there are no new infections of COVID-19. So that's pretty much the first time in a month. And for the restrictions, the government has already eased their restrictions since last week. However, the citizens of New Zealand are advised to still do social distancing so that the virus cannot come back to the country. At the same time, the government is now considering to ease more restrictions around next week. So that is definitely a very good sign for New Zealand here.
The travel bubble, Kunatha, in short, it means that it's an exclusive arrangement between New Zealand and Australia. We Thais people we don't have any part to play in that. It will be a bubble that would allow all the citizens from the two countries to travel to each other destinations. Yeah.
Yes, but do you think this kind of travel bubble, does it mean that ASEAN countries can help one another quite closely during this COVID-19 situation, because we also have this kind of agreement among ASEAN countries?
Of course, we have to make sure that each of the individual member countries can put its own house in order. That's the first thing they need to do, is to demonstrate that they are able to contain the spread of the virus. I think the reason why both New Zealand and Australia are in the position to discuss reopening their airspace is because they both confident in each other that we can manage, we can contain the pandemic. So if the same thing happens to ASEAN countries, and there is that possibility, but I'm sure that will be a long way off.
So tomorrow, Nad, we have something to look forward to from New Zealand and Australia. Perhaps they will have a
Definitely.
new solution tomorrow.
So the travel bubble, we have to see whether it's actually going to happen tomorrow. So this is still in consideration. So we will see whether the cabinet has approved the travel bubble to put in place in the near future. So if the travel bubble is in place, it will definitely help the tourism industry between both countries.